He arrived on a Thursday. I remember because I had just put away the groceries and the front door creaked open before I could even call out to my husband. I thought it was him, back early from the hardware store, but instead it was a tall, sunburnt man in a denim jacket with a duffel slung over one shoulder and the kind of swagger that didn't belong to anyone I had seen in this house before. And then I realized it was him. The nephew. Grown, broader, older. He hadn't been around for years. The last time I saw him, he was a lanky college kid who barely made eye contact and smelled like too much cologne. Now, he had lines at the corners of his eyes and arms like he'd worked with them. He smiled casually, but there was something behind it. Not charm exactly, more like a quiet awareness that the air shifted when he entered the room. And it had. I pretended it hadn't. That was always my skill, after all. Pretend, adjust, correct. My husband greeted him with the usual firm masculinity. Backslap, half hug. And I stood to the side, offering a polite smile and a glass of water. No hugs from me. But my fingers brushed his when he took the glass. And I noticed, instantly, that he didn't look away. His eyes lingered on mine with something too direct. Not inappropriate. Not yet. But definitely not forgettable. He was supposed to stay a few days. A work transition, a relationship that ended badly, a need to reset. The usual polite language men use to justify retreat. My husband offered the guest room, the shed keys, the car on weekends. I offered clean towels and silence. The first few days passed without note. We kept a polite rhythm. He ran early in the morning, shirtless with music in his ears. I baked more than I usually did, which was absurd. I don't even like sweets. But I liked the distraction. Liked the ritual of rolling out dough while his footsteps echoed on the porch outside. I told myself it was nothing. People notice people. That's human. But by the fourth day, I stopped being able to ignore the way his presence shifted the gravity of the house. At dinner, he made my husband laugh. Real, shaking lungs laughter I hadn't heard in months. My husband would look at me with affection, but the kind of affection you reserve for something stable, familiar, something you never expect to lose. I had become the reliable fixture, the steady hand, the responsible wife. But somewhere quietly, I had also become invisible. The change wasn't in him, it was in me. I noticed myself more, the way I'd pause before choosing a sweater, the way I spent a little longer brushing my hair, noticing how it curled when damp. I had always worn practical underwear, but that week, I found myself digging through a drawer for the black satin set I bought 5 years ago and never wore. Just to wear. Just to remember how it felt. And then there was the bathroom. It was a humid afternoon. I had come upstairs to find my phone when I heard the shower running. The bathroom door was open, just a crack, just enough to see fog on the mirror and his jeans in a pile near the sink. I turned to leave. I swear I did, but the sound of the water stopped, and before I could move, the door opened fully. He stood there with a towel low on his hips, water glistening down his chest. And for a second, an unmistakable second, he looked at me like a man looks at a woman. Not an aunt. Not a hostess. A woman. I didn't flinch. I didn't gasp. I didn't even move. I just watched him walk past me into the hallway, his arm brushing mine as he passed. And he didn't say a word. The silence between us that night at dinner was deafening. My husband asked him about jobs in Portland, asked if he planned to date again. He answered easily. But when I asked if he needed anything for his room, his eyes met mine for just a moment too long. He smiled faintly. "No," he said. "Everything's just fine." I don't remember what I said next. Or if I said anything at all. Later that night, lying beside my husband, I stared at the ceiling and felt my own skin like it didn't quite belong to me anymore. Something in me had been opened, quietly, without permission. Not lust. Not yet. Something smaller but far more dangerous. Recognition. That was the word. And the worst part wasn't that he had looked at me that way. It was that I had looked back. The next morning, I opened my closet and pulled out that satin bra again. Not because I planned anything. Not because I needed it, just because I wanted to remember what it felt like to dress for someone who might notice. And I knew then, before anything ever happened, that something already had. Not with a touch, not with a kiss, with a glance. And some things once glanced at can never be unseen. The next morning began like any other, but nothing about me felt ordinary. I moved through the kitchen with an exaggerated calmness, setting down mugs, slicing fruit, listening to the hum of the refrigerator as if silence itself were dangerous. He came in late, hair still damp, skin still warm from his run, and nodded. To me with that same quiet boldness he hadn't had as a boy. My husband had already left for work. Something about an early meeting, a shipment, a contractor. I barely heard the details anymore. Lately, his presence in our home felt like the ticking of a familiar clock, precise, functional, and completely predictable. He kissed me on the temple before he left, and I pretended not to notice how I didn't feel anything from it. No warmth, no flutter, just the soft press of habit. The nephew sat at the counter scrolling through his phone. "What's on the agenda today?" I asked. He shrugged. Thought I'd hit the hardware store, fix that loose hinge on the porch door. Of course he would. Every gesture from him lately was wrapped in something casual, masculine, helpful. And yet, every movement felt laced with something else. Something unspoken. He worked outside for hours while I rearranged cabinets that didn't need organizing. I changed outfits twice for no reason. First jeans and a tank top. Then a soft dress with a low back that I hadn't worn since the summer before last. It was one of those things you hold on to, not for comfort, but for the way it reminds you of who you used to be. Around 3, the sky darkened. One of those summer storms that arrives without warning. Loud, warm rain began to slam the windows, and the light shifted inside the house, softening everything. He came in, shirt soaked, laughing, to himself as he wiped his face with a rag. "Didn't see that coming," he said. "You're dripping all over my floor." He looked at the puddle, then back at me. "Want me to strip at the door?" It was a joke. A dumb, harmless joke. But it landed like a spark on dry grass. I turned away quickly, pretending to be annoyed, hiding the flush that rose to my neck. I told him to leave his shoes on the mat. I told him to grab a towel. I told him a lot of things that weren't the things I wanted to say. The moment passed, but not completely. That evening, with the storm behind us and the scent of wet earth still clinging to the air, he offered to help make dinner. I let him. He chopped vegetables. I grilled chicken. Our arms brushed twice. I apologized once. He didn't say anything either time. The kitchen felt smaller than it had the night before. By the time the food was ready, it was already dark. We sat on the porch to eat, the storm having cooled the heat just enough. I poured a second glass of wine, even though I didn't need it. He leaned back in his chair, looking up at the sky, and said, "You ever think about doing something reckless just to feel alive?" I didn't answer right away. I just watched. The way his jaw tensed when he swallowed. "Depends what you mean by reckless," I said. He turned his head toward me, and there it was again, that electric stillness between us. "You know what I mean?" he said. The porch lights flickered as a breeze moved through the trees. "Don't say things like that," I whispered. "Why not?" He didn't ask with challenge. He asked with certainty, like a man who already knew the answer. And then it happened. No warning, no orchestrated lead-in. He leaned across the small table, placed his hand on my jaw, and kissed me. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't aggressive. It was slow, as if we both needed to know how it felt before we decided anything else. My body responded before my brain could resist. My lips met his without hesitation. There was no panic, no guilt in the moment. Only heat. Only hunger that hadn't been fed in years. And then I pulled away. Not because I didn't want it, but because I wanted it too much. I stood abruptly, almost knocking over the wine glass. My heart beat so loudly I was sure the neighbors would hear it. "I have to go," I said. "I don't know why." I was already home. I left him on the porch and walked upstairs like a woman on fire. Not from shame, but from memory, from sensation, from the knowledge that my lips remembered him more clearly than they'd remembered my husband in months. In the mirror, I didn't look like myself. My cheeks were flushed. My collarbone rose and fell like I'd run a mile. I undressed slowly, each layer feeling like a confession. I stood in the shower for 15 minutes, water scalding, trying to rinse off something that wasn't physical. That night, my husband slept beside me like he always did, mouth slightly open, arms neatly folded. I stared at the ceiling again, not with fear, with clarity. I knew it now. That wasn't a moment I could undo. Not because we had crossed some point of no return, but because I had tasted what it was like to be wanted. Fully, directly, irreversibly, and I wasn't ready to give that up. Not yet. The morning after that kiss felt like waking up inside a different skin. I moved slowly, methodically, pouring coffee into my cup as though the weight of the ceramic might tether me to some version of normality. My husband stood near the sink, scrolling through his phone, his presence routine and unremarkable. He glanced at me briefly and said something about needing to check on the sprinkler system before work. I nodded, pretending I heard. My ears were still ringing with a silence I hadn't earned. I caught my own reflection in the window, hair slightly tousled, neckline loose. There was a flush in my face that had nothing to do with the morning sun. My lips still tingled, not from touch, but from memory. It haunted me, clung to the edges of my thoughts like a shadow I couldn't turn from. I had crossed a threshold, not one visible to anyone else, but one I felt with every breath. And the worst part? I didn't feel regret. Not exactly. What I felt was hunger. Not for chaos or deception, but for that sharp, aching awareness I thought I had buried with my 20s. He was already outside when I walked past the window. Shirt off again, hammer in hand, fixing a loose board on the fence. His back flexed with each movement. I lingered longer than I should have, holding a dish towel in my hand like it was a shield. The day passed in a fog of small, slow moments. I overcooked lunch, I spilled detergent, I walked into a room and forgot why. But I knew exactly what I was avoiding, being alone with him, because I didn't trust myself not to open the door wider this time. In the late afternoon, after my husband had left for a meeting across town, I heard footsteps behind me on the stairs. I was standing in the hallway, folding laundry that didn't need folding, when his voice came low, too close. "You've been avoiding me." I didn't turn around. I finished smoothing a towel. My hands trembled slightly, but I kept my posture, calm as though that would neutralize the fire under my skin. We kissed. "That doesn't mean—" "It means something," he interrupted. I turned then, slowly, our eyes locking in a silence thick enough to drown in. "You're my husband's nephew. And you're his wife. Which one of us do you think carries more weight?" I should have stopped him there. I should have walked past him back into the safety of my routines, but I didn't. I stepped into the guest room and shut the door behind me, not to invite anything, but to breathe. He didn't follow. That was the problem. He didn't chase me like in some movie. He just stood there, calm, leaning on the railing, watching me like he was memorizing my movements. That kind of patience doesn't belong to boys. That kind of silence belongs to men who understand consequence and still choose risk. That night, at dinner, everything tasted bland. The food, the wine, the conversation. My husband laughed at a joke from the radio and asked the nephew about job interviews. He answered politely. I smiled where appropriate, but I wasn't in the room. I was still on that staircase, still in that glance. Later, as I cleared the plates, I noticed the faintest trace of his cologne on the back of the chair. It was subtle, warm, woodsy, unfamiliar. The kind of scent that didn't belong in our house, yet lingered like it had always known its way around our rooms. I went to bed early, claiming a headache. My husband offered me a painkiller and kissed my shoulder. I nodded, swallowed, closed my eyes, and pretended to sleep. I listened to the soft creak of the house, the mechanical hum of the ceiling fan. At some point, I realized I was still wearing the black satin bra I'd put on that morning. I hadn't even noticed. Or maybe I had, and hadn't wanted to take it off. Sometime past midnight, I heard movement in the hallway. Slow, measured steps. I didn't move. I listened. They passed my door, paused, then continued toward the kitchen. Water ran. A cabinet closed. A refrigerator hummed open. Then silence again. It wasn't just the kiss anymore. It was everything after it, every breath, every choice. The way I started watching the clock around the time he usually came back from errands. The way I adjusted my blouse before entering a room. The way my skin remembered his nearness more vividly than any moment with my husband in months. And still, I hadn't touched him again. But everything in me knew it was coming. Not like a storm. Not like fate. Like permission. Something I hadn't granted myself in years. And when I finally closed my eyes, the last thing I saw was the way his hand had brushed against the doorframe earlier. Casual, barely noticeable, but enough. Because in that small, unremarkable moment, I realized something terrifying. I didn't just want him to kiss me again. I wanted to kiss him back. Deliberately. The days that followed didn't feel like days. They passed more like fragments, interrupted, scenes from a life I could no longer keep whole. The morning routine remained intact. The smell of coffee, the click of the garage door as my husband left, the hum of news radio. But the silence that filled the spaces between had changed color. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It vibrated with tension, electric, almost musical in its ache. He was still in the house, still moving through it like it belonged to him just as much as it belonged to us. And maybe it did now, in ways my husband would never understand. I watched the way he leaned on door frames, how he carried mugs of coffee in one hand and a book in the other, how he sat in the living room late at night, with the lamp on, shirt off, legs stretched out, as if this were a temporary life he could grow roots in. I avoided him with the precision of someone rehearsing restraint, not because I didn't want to be near him, but because I already knew what would happen if I allowed myself to step across the line again. Once I caught myself adjusting my hair before walking into the same room as him, and I hated the thrill that rose in me from the simplicity of that act. I hadn't dressed for a man in years. I dressed to be appropriate, to be put together, to be acceptable. Now I dressed in ways that made me feel remembered. One afternoon, I stepped outside to check the plants on the back patio. I wasn't expecting him to be there, and for a moment, I froze. He was seated on the steps, elbows resting. On his knees, cigarette between his fingers, a habit he had kept secret until that moment. He didn't look up at first. Just said quietly, "Do you ever think about what people would say?" I stayed silent. The wind stirred the edge of the tablecloth. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower buzzed. Then he turned toward me. His eyes weren't playful. They were heavy, searching, but not for approval. "I mean," he said, "if anyone knew." I sat down, not close, but not far enough. I wasn't sure if it was defiance or curiosity. Maybe both. "I think about what I would say to myself," I answered. Finally. He smiled, but it wasn't amusement. It was darker than that. He flicked the cigarette into a coffee can, stood up, and stretched as though the air around us wasn't crackling. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not going to kiss you again. Not unless you ask me to." And then he walked inside, leaving me there with my pulse skidding under my ribs. That night, we were invited to a neighborhood gathering, something my husband insisted we attend. One of those summer grill-outs where everyone brings potato salad in glass bowls and talks about lawn care like it's a religion. I dressed simply, but the moment I stepped into the backyard, I felt exposed. Not because of the dress, but because of the eyes I could feel on my back before I even turned around. He was already there, laughing with two women from the end of the street, beer bottle in hand. He looked like someone who belonged in pictures, someone who didn't mind being watched. And then he saw me. His smile faltered, just for a breath, and then returned as if it had never left. We moved through the party like orbiting planets, never colliding, never touching. But I felt him. Every movement, every pause, every time he looked away and then looked back when no one else was paying attention. It was maddening. At some point, my husband disappeared inside to help with drinks. I found myself near the hedge, alone, breathing through the fabric of my dress like it might cool me down. Then I heard footsteps. It wasn't him. It was the neighbor. Marcia. Or Margie. Or something similar. She smiled too widely, like someone who noticed more than she let on. "So," she said, glancing toward the porch where he now stood with a plate of ribs, "he's your husband's nephew, right?" I nodded. Carefully. She sipped her wine. "Interesting, the way he looks at you." I felt the earth tilt slightly. "He's just very expressive," I said, forcing lightness. She chuckled. That's one word for it." And then she drifted off, leaving her comment hanging in the humid air like a warning bell no one else could hear. Later that night, after the guests were gone and the house had returned to its usual hush, I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing out the wine glasses. I didn't hear him come in. I didn't even know he was in the room until I felt it, his presence behind me like heat from a stove. "Saw the way she looked at you," he said quietly. I didn't turn around. "I think she suspects something." I reached for a towel. My hands were trembling, and I hated how obvious it felt. I hated even more how much I wanted to turn around, to close the space between us. "She doesn't know anything," I said. And then he took a step closer. "Neither do you." The distance between us now was thin enough to fall through. And still, I held it. Somehow. But my breath betrayed me. Shallow. Unsteady. He didn't touch me. He didn't lean in. He just stood there and let me feel every unspoken word hanging in the air between us. Then he left the room. That night, I lay awake, not just with guilt or desire, but with fear. Fear of how deeply I had come to crave the very thing I'd spent years learning to live without. It wasn't about love, or rebellion, or danger. It was about being seen, and the terrifying realization that once someone truly sees you, you can never go back to being invisible. The day of the trip began without ceremony. My husband had left early, long before I even opened my eyes, his schedule pinned to the refrigerator in his blocky handwriting. Something about a client visit 2 towns over, and then a conference call at the office. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I had the house to myself, and I wasn't alone. The idea came casually at first. I had mentioned that I needed to return a few items to a shop in a neighboring city, just a quick drive, there and back. He offered to come with me, said it might be good to get out of the house, stretch our legs. I should have said no. Every part of me knew that. But I didn't. I nodded and said sure with a calm that didn't match the storm already starting to spiral in my chest. We didn't speak much during the drive. The silence was thick but not awkward. He had one arm out the window, wind catching his shirt sleeve, sunglasses on, lips pressed in a line that said nothing and everything. I kept my hands on the wheel, knuckles too tight, breath measured. Each mile stretched like a wire between us, tension tightening with every sign we passed. The store didn't matter. I couldn't have told you what we bought or returned, or even if we spoke to anyone. It was a placeholder, a decoy for whatever it was we both knew was coming. When we walked back to the car, he looked up at the sky and said, "Looks like rain." It didn't. It was clear, dry, warm. But his tone wasn't about the weather. We drove in silence again, until I turned off the main road. He looked over, at me without speaking, but his brow lifted just slightly. The road narrowed, curved. It was a place I remembered from years ago, a roadside motel behind a diner, the kind of place that had existed long before chain hotels made everything too clean, too predictable. I pulled in without thinking. Or rather, I thought about it so much that the act of doing it felt inevitable. I told myself I needed to rest, that I didn't feel well, that we'd grab a drink at the diner and wait for traffic to thin out. That was the lie I wrapped around the truth like a silk scarf, soft, comforting, but completely transparent. He followed me into the lobby without question. No jokes, no smiles. We didn't even make eye contact. I paid in cash. The room was cold from the air conditioner, the kind of cold that makes your skin feel too present. The curtains were drawn. The bedspread had a pattern I didn't bother to register. I placed my bag on the chair and stood in the middle of the room like a woman who'd forgotten her part in a play she had written herself. He didn't speak first. I did. I shouldn't have brought us here. He stepped closer. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Just close enough that I could feel the air change. I didn't ask to come, he said. That was the truth. He hadn't. He'd simply said yes. And then the silence wrapped around us again, charged, warm, impossible to ignore. I turned away. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the drawer by the bed, as if searching for some forgotten instruction manual on how to behave like a good person. When I closed it, he was behind me. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. His voice was low, careful. You don't owe me anything. I know, I said. Then why are we here? I didn't answer. I stepped away, sat on the edge of the bed. My legs felt numb, my throat dry. I had never been a woman who did things like this. And yet, here I was. He knelt in front of me, placed his hands gently on my knees, not possessively, not forcefully, but with the reverence of someone touching something fragile. Not because it might break, but because it already had. The kiss this time wasn't a question. It was an answer. To everything I hadn't said. To every moment I had held myself together while my insides begged for release. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't careful. But it wasn't reckless either. It was precise. Intentional. He kissed me like he had been waiting. Not for a moment, but for a sign that he was allowed to want me. And I kissed him back, not because I was weak, or confused, or lost, but because for the first time in years I felt chosen, not claimed, not assigned, not bound by vows written in ink that had long since faded, but chosen in the way that makes your skin remember what it means to be more than just functional. Afterward, we lay there in silence, side by side, not touching. Not out of shame, but because touching would have meant continuing, and we weren't ready for that. Not yet. Not in that moment. The air between us buzzed with something I couldn't name. Not guilt. Not exactly. It was something heavier. Something real. He turned to me, his voice hoarse. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I didn't reply. Because deep down, I knew he already had, not my marriage, not my loyalty, but something quieter. Something more essential. He had taken the part of me that still believed I was untouchable. We drove back in silence again. But this silence was different. It was full. Alive. And I knew, without needing to say it, that nothing in my life would ever be the same. Nothing changed. And everything did. The house greeted me with the familiar creak of floorboards and the steady hum of the air conditioner. My slippers waited by the doorway as if I'd simply stepped out to buy milk. The fridge still bore my husband's to-do list, and his favorite. Mug sat rinsed and turned upside down in the sink. Everything looked exactly as it always had. And yet, it all felt off. Inside me, something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. It wasn't guilt, not panic. It was closer to awareness. A clear, unsettling awareness that I had stepped into a version of myself I didn't know existed. I had peeled back something I didn't even know was hiding, and now it refused to go back into place. I moved more quietly through the house. Not to hide anything. He wouldn't have noticed anyway. My husband was too wrapped up in the rhythm of his days, too certain of the world he'd built, to sense the subtle changes in my pauses, in my silences, in the way I lingered too long by the sink or stared too long at nothing. I cooked more than usual, planned meals ahead of time. I told him I had headaches or that I wasn't sleeping well. These things were half true. Sleep was no longer rest. It was an endless series of memories I hadn't asked for. The feel of breath on my collarbone, the warmth of skin that wasn't supposed to be remembered, the weight of a glance that had unstitched something in me. At night, when my husband lay beside me, I let his hand rest on my back like it always had. But my body didn't respond. It tolerated. It endured. His affection had become a gesture, stripped of intention, like shaking hands out of habit or saying, "Bless you" to a stranger. Kind, automatic, empty. He tried. That was the worst part. He really tried. He noticed my distance and filled it with oranges from the market, with soft towels folded neatly in the linen closet, with murmured suggestions that we should plan a weekend away. Just us. But he wasn't touching the part of me that had gone missing. The part that had reawakened in that motel room, in a kiss that had lasted longer in my chest than it had on my lips. The nephew, he had changed too, not outwardly. He still moved through the house with casual ease, still left half-drunk glasses on the counter, still offered to carry in groceries or fix the leaky faucet. But there was a quietness in him now that hadn't been there before. A precision in how he looked at me when he looked at me, as if he was always calculating the moment, always deciding whether to speak or hold back. We no longer joked. No playful comments, no teasing glances. Instead, we lived in a silence that buzzed with memory, a charged stillness that stretched between us like a thread pulled too tight. One afternoon, I found him in the garage, wiping his hands on a rag, the hood of my husband's car open. I hadn't even heard him come home. He looked up. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, without smiling, he asked, "How are you doing?" It was the first time he'd spoken directly to me in days. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came. Not because I didn't have words, because I didn't know how to say the truth, that I felt like a woman split in two, that my body still remembered the curve of his jaw, the heat of his breath, the way his hands had found the soft places I'd forgotten I had. Instead, I said, "I'm fine." He nodded once and turned back to the engine. Later that evening, I tried again with my husband. I sat beside him on the couch, let his arm wrap around my shoulder, tried to imagine what it would feel like to want that again. He kissed my temple, murmured something about a movie. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the slow, even beat of a heart that had loved me for years, but I couldn't feel anything. I wasn't angry. I wasn't cold. I was absent. It wasn't that I didn't love him. It was that I no longer belonged to the version of myself that had built a life solely around being loved by him. And the more I tried to return to her, the more I dressed in soft sweaters, cooked his favorite meals, told him about errands and the neighbor's dog, the more I realized she wasn't coming back. The woman who had said yes to a motel room wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a mistake. She was a mirror. And now that I had looked into her face, I couldn't unsee her. The unraveling didn't happen all at once. It came in fragments, too subtle to trace back to one moment, too steady to ignore. I had convinced myself that what happened in that motel room could be folded neatly into the past. That desire could be packed away like a season's clothes, hidden until memory faded and routine returned. But desire, I've learned, doesn't fold. It spills. It leaks through glances, through passing footsteps, through breath. I tried harder than ever to act the same. I was present in the kitchen, attentive to my husband's monologues about work, kind in the ways I had always been kind. I even made the bed with extra care, placing the pillows exactly the way he liked them. And yet, none of it reached the part of me that felt real now. It was as if I was playing a version of myself I had already outgrown. He didn't suspect a thing. Or if he did, he didn't want to ask. That's the way long marriages sometimes work. Truths are sensed but not spoken, not because of cowardice, but because too much is at stake in the asking. The silence between the nephew and me, however, had become unbearable. It wasn't the silence of shame or retreat. It was the silence of tension coiled too tightly. We avoided being alone in rooms. We spoke only in practical terms: groceries, schedules, errands. And yet, each word we exchanged came coated in a layer of memory. I could still feel the press of his lips on my throat when he asked if we were out of milk. I still saw the shadow of his hand on my hip when he handed me the car keys. Nothing we did was inappropriate. That's what made it worse. We were perfectly behaved until we weren't. It was a Thursday when it happened again. My husband had left early for an overnight conference, something regional, forgettable. The house felt different when he was gone, as if the walls relaxed in his absence. I'd been in the laundry room, folding towels, when I heard the front door open. He called my name, his voice too casual. I answered without turning. "Back here." He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. There was a moment, just a breath, before he said anything. "I think we need to talk." The words sat between us like something heavy. I nodded slowly, still not looking at him. I folded one more towel, too slowly, too precisely. When I finally did meet his eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected. Restraint, not regret, not frustration, something quieter. As if he'd been fighting the same war and had finally laid down arms. We didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "I've been trying to be respectful, to give you space, but I'm losing my mind." I inhaled sharply, my hands gripped the edge of the table behind me. "I know," I said. It was the first real thing I'd said to him in weeks. He took a step closer, then another. But there was no urgency in it, only inevitability. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered. "I know," I repeated, and then I kissed him. I don't know who moved first. I don't know if my hands found his face or if his mouth found mine. What I do know is that the kiss didn't feel like temptation this time. It felt like collapse. Like two people finally falling into the truth they had been circling around for too long. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't desperate. It was slow, intentional, unbearably intimate. His hand settled on my waist with a gentleness that felt like reverence. Mine curled into his shirt like I needed something to hold on to. The room was quiet. No music, no distractions, only breath and the low creak of the floor as we shifted closer. At one point, he paused, his forehead resting against mine, our eyes closed. "We're past the point of no return, aren't we?" he asked. I didn't answer, because we were. And for the first time, I didn't care what that meant. The rest of the day unfolded in silence. Not cold, not shameful, just full. The kind of silence that follows an earthquake. Not because there's nothing left to say, but because everything has already been said with hands and mouths and heartbeats. When evening came, I showered and changed. I stared at myself in the mirror, wrapped in a towel, hair wet, lips swollen. I looked more alive than I had in years. Not beautiful, not youthful, just present. He was in the living room when I came out reading. He looked up, met my eyes, and didn't speak. There was no need. Later that night, as I lay in bed alone, my husband still away, the house breathing in its quiet rhythm, I tried to locate what exactly I was feeling. It wasn't love. Not in the traditional sense. It wasn't lust either, though that lingered in my bones like heat from a dying fire. It was something closer to freedom. And also something much darker. Because freedom, I was learning, has a price. And I had just signed the bill with my body. He left 3 days later. There was no ceremony, no confrontation, just a short conversation over breakfast between him and my husband, words about an out-of-state job offer, a friend with a spare room, a chance to start fresh. He didn't look at me when he said it, but I could feel the weight of what he didn't say pressing against the edges of every syllable. I stood by the sink, drying a plate that didn't need drying, pretending to listen, pretending not to feel the ache that had bloomed in my chest overnight. I hadn't asked him to stay. I hadn't asked him to leave. I hadn't said anything at all. And maybe that was why it hurt. Because sometimes silence feels like abandonment when you've tasted the sound of someone knowing you too well. My husband, satisfied with the explanation, clapped him on the back and said he understood. That it was good timing. That everyone needs a reset now and then. I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. A reset. As if we were nothing more than computers needing a restart. As if memories could be deleted just because someone decided to walk away. By noon, he was gone. The room was empty. The bedsheets were folded, the closet cleared, and yet the air still held him, his scent, his heat, the echo of laughter I had never allowed myself to fully laugh back at. I walked past the door 3 times before finally stepping inside. It looked exactly the way it had before he arrived, as though nothing had happened, but I knew better. I stood in the center of the room, staring at the wall, heart hollow, trying to piece together whether I felt grief or relief. It was both. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside my husband as he dozed in and out of shallow breathing, the television flickering against the wall in muted colors. I watched his profile, the familiar slope of his nose, the slight twitch in his brow when he dreamed. He had always looked peaceful in sleep, trusting, vulnerable in a way he never let himself be when awake. And I hated myself for the distance I had created, not because it was wrong, but because it felt irreversible. Like some invisible rope between us had finally frayed beyond repair. There were no bruises, no betrayals shouted across the room, no broken plates. Just this quiet, unbearable fracture. I wanted to reach out to him, to rest my hand on his chest and feel it rise and fall, to remember that he was still the man I married. But my body wouldn't move. My arm lay paralyzed by a truth too heavy to lift. In the morning, he surprised me with a suggestion: 2 plane tickets for a weekend away. He had planned it quietly, without telling me, thinking maybe the time alone would bring us closer again. The kindness of it undid me more than any accusation could have, because it wasn't anger I feared. It was love. Honest, tired, enduring love. I nodded and thanked him. I didn't say yes. Instead, I told him I needed time alone, that I'd been feeling overwhelmed, emotionally drained, that maybe it would be good if he went without me, cleared his mind, enjoyed himself. He hesitated but agreed, perhaps relieved by the excuse to relax. He kissed my forehead before he left and told me to rest, said he'd call when he landed. When the door closed behind him, I didn't cry. I sat in the quiet and stared out the window for hours. The world outside looked unchanged. Lawns freshly cut, sprinklers hissing, delivery trucks passing with dull indifference. But inside me, nothing was where I left it. I went upstairs and opened the drawer where I had hidden the bra I wore that day in the motel. Black satin, thin straps. A garment that once made me feel powerful, untouchable. Now, it felt like a relic from a version of myself I no longer recognized. I touched the fabric, let it slip through my fingers, then folded it gently and placed it in the trash. Not because I regretted what had happened, but because I didn't need a souvenir to remember it. Later, I walked the neighborhood. The sidewalks were warm beneath my sandals. I nodded to neighbors, smiled when appropriate, waved at passing cars. I performed the rituals of suburban normalcy with the precision of a woman determined not to be found out. And yet, everything in me wanted to be discovered. I imagined someone asking, plainly, "Are you all right?" Not in the polite way, in the real way. The kind that digs. The kind that waits for the truth no matter how long it takes to form. No one asked, no one ever does. That night, I poured a glass of wine and sat in the garden. The air smelled of jasmine and early dusk. I could hear the cicadas, the distant hum of a lawnmower. I closed my eyes and tried to recall the exact moment things began to unravel. Was it the glance in the hallway? The damp towel in his hands? The kiss? Or had it started much earlier? In the quiet, accumulating spaces between who I was and who I had become. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't about him. Not really, he was the spark. But I had been dry wood for years, and now, with the match struck, all I could do was burn quietly. Weeks passed, though I couldn't say how many. Time had a strange way of stretching and folding in on itself after he left. The days looked the same. Morning coffee, the hum of appliances, phone calls from my husband, weather updates, grocery lists. But the inner rhythm of my life had shifted into something slower, heavier. As if I was walking underwater, performing my duties while holding my breath. He didn't write, he didn't call, and I didn't reach out. Not because I didn't want to, but because I feared what it would mean to admit, even to myself, that his absence felt more vivid than most people's. presence. I had told myself it was temporary, that the feeling would dull, that soon I would return to the version of myself who could go entire seasons without needing to be wanted. But she didn't come back. Instead, I moved through the days like a person recently returned from war, aware of how fragile peace can be, how quiet can become unbearable once you've heard what it's like to be truly seen. My husband noticed, though not in the way that mattered. He commented on my mood, offered to help with small tasks, asked more often if everything was all right. I nodded, kissed his cheek, told him I was fine, and sometimes I almost believed myself. But there were nights when the wind carried a certain stillness through the windows, when I would lie in bed and feel that terrible aching clarity that I had undone something that could never be fully stitched back together. It wasn't the act itself. It was the awakening. I had lived a life that was tidy, deliberate, safe. A life built on shared calendars and dependable dinners and 2 matching toothbrushes in a glass by the sink. I had loved my husband deeply. I still did, in a way. But the kind of love we shared now felt like an heirloom, carefully preserved, rarely touched, admired more for what it had once been than for what it was now. One morning, I opened my closet and stood in front of the clothes I used to wear without thought. Cardigans, cotton dresses, slacks in safe colors. All of it looked familiar, and yet none of it felt like mine. I put on a white blouse, tucked it in, then pulled it back off. I tried a summer dress, took that off too. Finally, I put on jeans, and an old shirt from a concert I'd forgotten I even attended. Something with holes near the hem, soft from years of washings. I looked in the mirror. I didn't recognize the woman staring back, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't flinch from her. She looked tired, but honest, stripped of costume. Later that day, I went into the guest room, the one where he had stayed. I hadn't entered it since the morning he left. Everything was still in place. The window cracked just enough to let in the smell of cut grass, the extra blanket folded at the foot of the bed, the faint indentation on the mattress where he used to sit. I sat in the same place and closed my eyes. There was no vision. No memory replayed itself. Just the pressure of the moment, the gravity of the choice I had made. Not once, but again and again, every time I had stepped toward him, every time I had chosen presence over denial. I realized then, I hadn't betrayed my marriage because I stopped loving my husband. I betrayed it because I stopped loving who I was within it. That afternoon, I didn't do the laundry. I didn't vacuum. I didn't answer emails or return calls. I walked, for hours, past streets I'd never noticed. Houses with peeling paint, gardens in bloom, teenagers yelling across front yards. The world went on, oblivious to the storm that had reshaped my interior life. When I came home, my husband was already back. He was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine he wasn't really reading. I stood in the doorway for a long time watching him. He looked up, smiled. "Hey," he said. "Everything okay?" I opened my mouth, but the words didn't come easily. They were too heavy to rush, too raw to decorate. "I think I need to tell you something," I said quietly. His smile faded. He didn't speak. He waited. The silence that followed stretched so long I thought it might crack the air between us. And then he said, just above a whisper, "I already know." I felt something rupture inside me. Not panic, not shame, just sorrow. "I didn't want to hurt you," I said. He nodded, but his eyes were distant. "I know." He didn't ask for details. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't walk out. He just sat there, hands resting on the table, the weight of everything we weren't saying pressing down like fog. After a while, he stood up, kissed my forehead, and went upstairs. I stayed where I was, unsure if this was the beginning of the end or the start of something new, something quieter, perhaps more honest. Not cleaner, but real. There was no explosive ending. No suitcase by the door, no slammed doors or broken glass, only stillness. only two people sitting in the ruins of something they'd both helped build, unsure of whether to rebuild it or finally let it fall. And me, alone in the kitchen, realizing that the deepest betrayals don't always come from outside. Sometimes they come from the person you've spent years becoming. And sometimes surviving them means admitting that you want more, even if you have no idea where that more will lead.